He left home to visit his sister. He was only 16. But before that ordinary afternoon in Samana was over, Bharat Vishwakarma would be dead, and a man recently released from prison would be in police custody. His name was Guda Patel. Why did Guda attack Bharat? And what happened in those terrifying minutes that shocked an entire village? This is the case of Guda Patel and Bharat Vishwakarma. On March 5, 2026, Bharat Vishwakarma left his home for what should have been an ordinary family visit. He was only 16 years old. That day was Bhai Dooj, a festival traditionally associated with the bond between brothers and sisters. Bharat was going to visit his elder sister, who lived in Samana village in Damo district, Madhya Pradesh. There was nothing unusual about the plan. Bharat was not going to meet an enemy. He was not looking for trouble. According to reports, he was simply going to his sister's home. But before the day was over, Bharat would be dead. And the man accused of killing him would leave behind a crime scene so disturbing that it shocked an entire village. His name was Guda Patel. Guda was 46 years old. And this was not the first time his name had been connected to a serious crime. But before we get to his past, we need to understand who Bharat was, and why he happened to be in Samana that afternoon. A 16-year-old who went to see his sister. Bharat Vishwakarma lived with his family in the Damo area. Like many young people from modest families, he had started working at a young age. His life was centered around ordinary responsibilities, work, family, and helping those close to him. His sister was married and lived in Samana village. Bharat had gone there to see her. For a family, a visit like this would normally mean nothing more than a few hours together, but on March 5, everything changed. According to reports, Bharat arrived in Samana with his cousin Vijay Vishwakarma. They were traveling on a motorcycle. There was no indication that Bharat knew he was walking into danger. No one could have imagined that the person they were about to encounter had a violent criminal history. The man everyone was talking about. Samana was a small village where people knew one another. And among the people living there was Guda Patel. According to local accounts cited in reports, people in the area were familiar with Guda and were aware of his troubled past. He had previously been imprisoned in connection with the killing of his wife. After spending years in prison, Guda had been released only a short time before the March 5 incident. That detail would become extremely important later. Because when Bharat arrived in Samana, Guda was already there. And whatever happened in those few minutes between the two men would turn an ordinary afternoon into a murder investigation. Around 2:30 in the afternoon. It was around the afternoon when Bharat and Vijay reached the area near Bharat's sister's home. They were traveling on the motorcycle. Then, according to the police account reported by the media, Guda Patel suddenly approached Bharat. He was carrying an iron rod. There was no long argument described in the initial reports. No extended confrontation. The attack happened suddenly. Guda allegedly struck Bharat on the head with the iron rod. The blow was severe. Bharat fell from the motorcycle. Vijay, who was with him, witnessed the attack. And in that moment, the situation became terrifying. Vijay reportedly ran for help. People from the village began to gather. But the attack was not over. According to police and media reports, Guda went back toward his house and returned carrying a hammer. What happened next is the part of this case that shocked investigators, villagers, and people across the region. Guda allegedly attacked the unconscious teenager again with the hammer. And the reports that followed described an extremely disturbing scene. Villagers who reached the area reportedly claimed that Guda was drinking Bharat's blood and attempting to eat flesh from his head. These details are among the most disturbing allegations in the case, and they have been reported as statements attributed to villagers and police accounts, not as something we should sensationalize or present beyond what the investigation establishes. But there was no doubt about the central fact. Bharat Vishwakarma had been brutally attacked. And he would not survive. The crowd confronts Guda. After the attack, Guda reportedly moved away from the scene and headed toward nearby fields. By then, villagers had alerted the police. People began gathering around the area. Some villagers reportedly tried to stop Guda from escaping by throwing stones from a distance. The situation was becoming increasingly tense. Guda attempted to run through the fields. But his escape did not last long. According to reports, he became entangled in wire in the field and fell. The weapon reportedly dropped from his hand. That gave the villagers an opportunity to overpower him. By the time police arrived, Guda Patel had been caught and was handed over to them. The man who had allegedly attacked a 16-year-old boy in broad daylight was now in police custody. But investigators were left with a much bigger question. Why? Why would a man attack a teenager who, according to the available reporting, had no known personal dispute with him? What could have triggered such extreme violence? And perhaps most importantly, how had a man with a previous murder conviction come to be living in the same community again after his release from prison? Those questions would lead investigators back into Guda Patel's past. A past that had already terrified the people who knew him. And as that past began to emerge, the March 5th killing started to look even more disturbing. Because Bharat may have been an innocent teenager caught in a sudden act of violence. But Guda Patel was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. He had been there before. And only weeks after his release from prison, another life had been lost. But what exactly happened during those years behind bars, and what was known about Guda Patel before Bharat's death? That is where the history takes a darker turn. The most disturbing question in the case of Bharat Vishwakarma was not only how such a brutal attack could happen. It was why the man accused of carrying it out was already known to the criminal justice system. Guda Patel was not a name that appeared for the first time in police records on March 5, 2026. Years before Bharat's death, Guda had already been convicted in connection with the killing of his wife. According to reports, the earlier case had resulted in a long prison sentence. Guda spent years behind bars. For the people of Samana, that history mattered. Because when he eventually returned to the village, he was not simply another resident coming home after a long absence. He was a man whose past was already known. A past that followed him home. The exact circumstances surrounding Guda's earlier conviction have been described differently in local accounts, but reports agree on one important point: he had previously been imprisoned for the killing of his wife. He remained in prison for years. Then, in January 2026, Guda was released. His return to the village came only weeks before the death of Bharat Vishwakarma. That timeline would later become one of the most striking details of the case. A man with a previous murder conviction had returned to the same community. And less than 2 months later, police would once again take him into custody, this time in connection with the death of a teenager. But it is important to separate what is known from what people believed. Some local accounts described Guda's behavior after his release as unusual. There were claims that he would wander around the village alone and behave unpredictably. Some people reportedly felt uncomfortable around him. But those observations, by themselves, do not establish that he was mentally ill or that he was certain to commit another crime. That distinction matters. Mental illness cannot be diagnosed from someone's behavior in a news report, and unusual behavior does not automatically make someone violent. What we do know is that concerns about Guda existed within the community, while the investigation into Bharat's death would later focus on what happened on March 5. The day Guda was alone. According to reports, Guda was at home on the day of the attack. His son was reportedly away from the village. That meant Guda was alone when Bharat and his cousin arrived near Bharat's sister's home. And somewhere during that afternoon, the two men crossed paths. There is still an important gap in the story. The motive. Why did Guda target Bharat? Was there an argument? Was there a personal dispute? Was it a misunderstanding? Or was the attack completely unexpected? The initial reports did not establish a clear motive. And that is one of the reasons this case remains so disturbing. Bharat was a teenager visiting his sister. There was no publicly established history of a long-running feud between him and Guda that would explain what happened. Instead, the violence appears to have erupted suddenly. What witnesses described? The eyewitness accounts made the case even more shocking. Bharat was allegedly struck with an iron rod before Guda returned with a hammer. By the time villagers reached the scene, Bharat was critically injured. What some villagers reportedly witnessed after the attack was far more disturbing. News reports citing police and local witnesses said Guda was allegedly drinking blood from Bharat and attempting to eat flesh from his head. Those details quickly spread through local and national media. They also transformed the case from a shocking village murder into a story that attracted widespread public attention. But there is an important reason to use careful language here. A documentary should distinguish between the fact that Bharat was violently attacked and died, and the more graphic descriptions reported by witnesses. The first is central to the criminal case. The second involves witness accounts and allegations that investigators must establish through evidence. That distinction protects the credibility of the entire documentary. Because the goal is not simply to make the story sound horrifying. The goal is to understand what actually happened. The arrest. After Guda allegedly fled toward the fields, villagers attempted to stop him. Police were called. The confrontation continued until Guda reportedly became trapped in wire while trying to escape. He fell, and villagers were able to catch him. Police then took him into custody. The weapon involved in the attack was also reportedly recovered. For the villagers, the immediate fear was over. But for Bharat's family, the nightmare had only begun. A 16-year-old had left home for a family visit. He would never return. His death left his family trying to understand how a normal day could turn into something so violent. And while the police investigation moved forward, attention naturally returned to Guda Patel's past. How had he come out of prison? What were the exact circumstances of his earlier conviction? And was there anything that could have explained what happened on March 5th? A question about release. It is tempting to look at the timeline and conclude that Guda should never have been released. But that is not something a documentary should decide without knowing the legal details of his previous case. A person completing a sentence or being released through a legal process does not automatically mean that the justice system has failed. At the same time, Guda's case raises legitimate questions about what happens when people convicted of serious violent crimes return to their communities. What kind of supervision exists after release? Are there mechanisms for monitoring people who may pose a genuine risk? What responsibilities fall on families, local authorities, and the justice system? And what happens when warning signs are reported by ordinary people? These are difficult questions. But they are important precisely because the consequences can be irreversible. In Bharat's case, the consequence was the loss of a young life. The investigation moves forward. Guda Patel was arrested and the investigation continued. Police now had to establish the exact sequence of events. They had to determine what triggered the attack. They had to examine witness statements. They had to collect physical evidence from the scene. And they had to reconstruct what happened between the moment Bharat arrived in Samana and the moment police took Guda into custody. Because the most disturbing part of the case was not simply what happened after the attack. It was what remained unknown. Why Bharat? Why that day? And why did the violence become so extreme? For Bharat's family, those questions would never bring him back. But for investigators, answering them could be the key to understanding the crime. And there was one more piece of Guda Patel's history that needed to be examined. His earlier murder conviction. Because long before Bharat's death shocked Samana, another woman had already lost her life in connection with Guda. And understanding that earlier case is essential to understanding why his return to the village had become such a sensitive issue. That story takes us back years, long before March 5, 2026, to the crime that first sent Guda Patel to prison. By the time Guda Patel was taken into police custody, the immediate danger in Samana had ended. But the questions had only begun. A 16-year-old boy was dead. A man with a previous murder conviction was once again behind bars. And investigators now had to determine exactly what had happened on March 5, 2026. For Bharat Vishwakarma's family, however, there was no investigation that could undo what had happened. There was only an empty space where a son and brother had been. What the police had to establish. An arrest is not the same thing as a conviction. That distinction is especially important in a case surrounded by disturbing reports and intense public attention. Police had to establish the sequence of events through evidence. They had to examine the crime scene. They had to record witness statements. They had to determine what weapons were used. They had to establish the cause of Bharat's death. And they had to investigate the circumstances that led to the attack. Perhaps the biggest question was the motive. Why did Guda Patel attack Bharat? At the time of the reported investigation, there was no clear publicly established explanation that could answer that question. And sometimes, that is the most disturbing part of a murder investigation. The victim may be completely unable to explain what happened. The witnesses may only see part of the event. And the suspect may provide an explanation that investigators then have to test against the evidence. Until that process is complete, assumptions can be dangerous. The most disturbing allegations. The reports about what happened after Bharat was attacked attracted enormous attention. Villagers reportedly told police that Guda had engaged in extremely disturbing behavior involving Bharat's blood and flesh. Those allegations were repeated in multiple reports. But a responsible documentary has to make an important distinction. The fact that Bharat was attacked and died is at the center of the criminal case. The more graphic descriptions come from reported witness accounts and police statements. They should therefore be described as such unless and until a court establishes them as proven facts. That does not make the allegations less disturbing. It simply keeps the documentary honest. True crime should not require exaggeration. The reality of what happened to Bharat is already devastating. The man who had already served time. Then there is the issue that made this case especially difficult for the people of Samana. Guda Patel had already been convicted in a previous murder case involving his wife. He had spent years in prison. And according to reports, he was released in January 2026. Only weeks later, Bharat Vishwakarma was killed. That timeline naturally raises questions about the criminal justice system. But there is a danger in reaching conclusions too quickly. If someone has completed a sentence or has been legally released, society cannot simply assume that the person will commit another crime. At the same time, systems exist precisely because governments and courts have to balance two difficult responsibilities. One is protecting the public. The other is respecting the legal rights of people who have completed or otherwise lawfully ended their sentences. The question, therefore, is not simply, why was Guda allowed to come back? The more useful questions are, what were the legal conditions of his release? Was he subject to any supervision? Were there documented concerns about his behavior? Were authorities legally empowered to take preventive action? And if concerns existed, were those concerns formally reported? Those are questions that can only be answered through records and official investigation. Without those records, blaming a particular person or institution would be speculation. What about mental health? Another issue quickly appears whenever a crime is described as unusually violent. People begin asking whether the accused was mentally ill. In Guda's case, some local accounts described his behavior as strange or unstable after his release. But that does not establish a medical diagnosis. Mental illness and violence are not synonymous. Most people with mental health conditions are not violent. And unusual behavior alone cannot tell us why someone committed a crime. If Guda's mental state becomes relevant to the legal proceedings, that would have to be assessed through proper medical and legal processes. A documentary should not diagnose someone based on eyewitness descriptions. That would not be responsible reporting. The question of prevention. Still, one question remains legitimate. Could the tragedy have been prevented? Nobody can honestly answer that without knowing what authorities, family members, and community members actually knew before March 5. Perhaps there were warning signs. Perhaps there were not. Perhaps people were concerned but had no legal basis to intervene. Or perhaps there were details that have not yet become public. That is why the investigation matters. It is also why this case should not be reduced to a simple story of a monster and an innocent victim. Real criminal cases are more complicated. They involve people, institutions, evidence, laws, and decisions made long before the final crime occurs. Bharat's final journey. But while investigators work through those questions, there is one fact that cannot be changed. Bharat left home that day to visit his sister. He was 16 years old. He did not know that the journey would become his last. He did not know that his name would later appear in newspapers across India. He did not know that the circumstances of his death would shock people far beyond his village. For his family, he was not a headline. He was a son. A brother. A young person whose life had barely begun. And that is the part of the story that should never be forgotten. Because when a crime becomes viral, there is always a risk that the victim disappears behind the shocking details. The weapons. The allegations. The suspect's past. The rumors. The disturbing descriptions. All of those things may attract attention. But at the center of this case was a 16-year-old boy who never came home. What happens next? Guda Patel was arrested in connection with Bharat's death. The investigation would have to determine the exact circumstances of the killing, establish the evidence against the accused, and clarify the questions surrounding motive and the events leading up to the attack. The case would then move through the legal system. And that is where responsibility ultimately lies. Not with social media. Not with rumors. Not with sensational videos. But with evidence. Witnesses. Forensic findings. Police investigation. And ultimately, the courts. Until a court reaches a final determination, the accused should be described as an accused, not as a person already convicted of Bharat's murder. That may sound like a technical distinction. It is not. It is one of the most important principles of responsible true crime storytelling. A final question. The story of Guda Patel leaves behind a question that is much bigger than one village. What should happen when a person convicted of a serious violent crime eventually returns to society? How should communities respond? What kind of support or supervision should exist? And how can authorities identify genuine risks without simply assuming that every former prisoner will re-offend? There are no easy answers. But these are questions worth asking. Because prevention is not about predicting the future perfectly. It is about learning from the past. And if this case eventually reveals that warning signs were missed, then those lessons should be examined carefully. Not to create another sensational story, but to prevent another family from experiencing the same kind of loss. The last image. Imagine Bharat leaving home that afternoon. A teenager going to see his sister. A completely ordinary journey. Perhaps his family expected him to return later that day. Perhaps someone was waiting for him. Perhaps there were plans for the evening. None of them could have known that he would never walk back through that door. That is what makes this case so difficult to forget. It was not a distant war. It was not an impossible story from a horror movie. It happened in an ordinary community. On an ordinary afternoon. To a young person who had gone out to visit his family. And somewhere between leaving home and arriving at his sister's village, an ordinary day became a tragedy. The investigation may eventually answer why it happened. The courts may eventually determine responsibility. But no verdict can return Bharat Vishwakarma to his family. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember when we talk about cases like this. Behind every headline is a human life. Behind every crime scene is a family. And behind every shocking story is a victim whose life was much more than the circumstances of their death. Bharat was 16. He went to see his sister. He never came home. And the questions surrounding his death will remain until the evidence, and ultimately the law, provides the answers. This was the case of Guda Patel and the death of Bharat Vishwakarma. A case that shocked Samana, and one that leaves far more questions than easy answers.